It's 5:15, let's start. Welcome everybody in the lecture theatre here today, and welcome to those joining us online. I'd like to say a special welcome to members of our International Advisory Board, who I've been told have joined, plus our management board within the university and a number of alumni of the school. So welcome to you all. Let me start by saying briefly, I'm Clare. I'm a professor of economics at the school, but it's not about me, it's about our two guests. So let me introduce them. First, on my left is Professor Ken Rogoff. Ken is Maurits Boas Professor at Harvard University, and I'm sure people will know was formerly chief economist at the International Monetary Fund. He's an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences and the Academy of Arts and Sciences in the US, and is long ranked as one of the most highly cited economists. He also, an interesting fact, is an international grandmaster of chess, and if you've read the book, or soon will, you'll come across many fascinating chess anecdotes permeating the book that he's going to talk to you about today. Ken's best known for his pioneering work in macroeconomics, especially on central bank independence and on exchange rates. And for those of you that are students of economics, you may well remember reading about Rogoff conservative bankers. I certainly do remember that as a graduate student. If you haven't read it, it's a particularly beautiful paper, whatever your political leaning. So I recommend it highly. And as this week's Economist rightly notes, he's got a track record of an incredibly prescient, provocative arguments. So, for example, on the demise of what he calls in the book lower forever inflation and interest rates, or on the potential for a Chinese property crisis, he made the argument, and then lo and behold, what we saw. And as we will soon discuss, it already feels like he's done it again. Another one with whether the US dollar will remain preeminent and remain as the global reserve currency. And just to say, the book was written before Trump was actually elected. There's a very brief postscript on Trump's election in the book. So this is Professor Rogoff. Further to my left is Professor Andrea Ferrero. Andrea is Professor of Economics in the Department of Economics here in Oxford and a Senior Research Fellow at Trinity College. He, like Ken, is also an academic macroeconomist, but someone who spent extended periods of time at the policy coalface. So he spent an extended period of time at the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, and he's currently an advisor to the Bank of England here in the UK. He's published widely in the very best economics, including on the US Fed's unconventional policies, and he's currently working on the determinants of low interest rates, and I'm sure the two of you will engage on that topic. So that's introductions. Let me just say how things will run today. So we're going to start with a couple of just very big picture questions. And then I'm going to hand over to Andrea to probe in a little bit more depth some of the themes in the book. And I'm sure many of you in the room and those of you online will have questions you want to put to Ken at this particularly relevant time. So we're going to leave plenty of time for audience Q&A. If you are online, if you're listening online, please put your questions in the chat. I have an iPad here and should be able to pick them up. So that's it. Let's start. So I'm going to ask the obvious question. Is this the end of US dollar dominance?
It's certainly the end of the US soft power and many things as we know it. So a thesis in my book, which you get to only at the very end, is that the US dollar was in decline already before Trump got elected by some measures, but by one, I have some work with Ethan Olszewski and Carmen Reinhardt that have some measures of this. And I was also, there are various reasons for this, but it wasn't that the renminbi was going to replace the dollar or Bitcoin was going to replace the dollar. It was that the dollars would come down quite a few notches. And a lot of people find that, whoa, that's so surprising. You know, how could you think that? And I got that reaction a couple of months ago when I was telling friends, but also professors, people in the financial industry said that's ridiculous. And you know, if I lean into my age in this book, and just going back to 2005, 2006, the widespread view was that we would have a tripolar system. Barry Eichengreen had a paper about it. Jeffrey Frankel had a paper about it. There are actually a lot of conferences about it. And, you know, the euro would expand its footprint some. The renminbi would expand its footprint. And didn't happen over those 15 years. But there were good reasons why it would have happened. And I think that's worth bearing in mind when you say it's ridiculous to go back, you know, that we might go back to something like that. On top of that, there's, you know, very, very strong incentives for the rest of the world to want to have options. If you're Chinese, you really do. I mean, they're, come on, planning on blockading Taiwan at some point. Everyone believes that. And they've seen what we did to Russia, which was, it's not called a default, but that's only because we get to label what's a default and not a default when we don't let them have their central bank reserves for, you know, an indefinite period. And certainly the sanctions that we put on Russia, which maybe haven't been as effective as hoped, but pretty dramatic. Believe me, the Chinese are looking at that and developing their own relationships, their own rails. It's not just the Chinese that don't like it. Nobody does. I had I'll just say a G5 central banker visit my office at Harvard within the last 10 years. I don't want to identify the person. I'll say it was a he. It was not Christine Lagarde. And was complaining that he had just bought something for his spouse, actually in Europe, but using an American charge card. And it just infuriated him that Donald Trump could see it. Because the dollar is so dominant, the rails of the system, the network of connections, all goes through the United States. And there are actually reasons for that. I won't have time to go into this explanation, but they do. A lot of people don't like that. In fact, the Europeans have been trying very hard to get away from that. So there's a big appetite. But of course, you know, the root problem, as I say in the book, is the biggest problems lie within. I think the United States has an unsustainable budget deficit. And you know, we're a country that no matter how rich we are, we'd have an unsustainable budget deficit. I mean, this is a political economy problem. That's not an arithmetic problem, but we do. You're watching Donald Trump beat up on the Federal Reserve, but the progressives have real plans for the Federal Reserve. I speak to Elizabeth Warren's economists and many others, and I read their books. And there's a lot of pressures on central bank independence. So sort of, you know, there are definitely problems from within. Say one or two more things about the book. I mean, there's a lot. That's the very end of the book. You get there learning about the history. And I think the U.S. has had a lot of luck to get to where it was. There are a lot of turns where you could have had something where the U.S. was much less dominant than it was. But there are a lot of twists and turns. And I'll lastly say, the writing in it's somewhat, I will say, experimental. I was very influenced by my wife, had a book a couple of years ago, which you should invite to give a talk, called Muppets in Moscow, which is going to eventually be a movie. I sort of followed, you know, some of that by using snippets of things in my life to motivate what was going on. I mean, you know, it's not a memoir, but meetings with world leaders, policymakers, chess players. I don't think I have any current students, but former students. Many things of where did a problem come up, and you know, sometimes I'm explaining something and I'm right. Sometimes I'm explaining something and I'm wrong, and trying to give it some life to what's going on. So. Oh yes, one last thing, the title, Our Dollar, Your Problem. Some of you may know this, many of you may know this, but there's a famous saying from when probably the biggest shock we had since Trump tariffs. And in some ways comparables. When Nixon took the United States off the gold standard in 1971, we went off in 1933 for individuals. If you're an individual, the dollar bills used to say exchangeable for gold, and it's in the same in the UK. And then Franklin D. Roosevelt said, no, you can't even hold gold. That part changed, but we weren't allowed to exchange dollars for gold. But countries were. It was a fixed exchange rate system. The U.S. could do whatever it wanted, but it had to stand by the dollar for gold. And in 1971, the U.S. had started the Vietnam War, the Great Society. We were getting a bit of inflation. And Nixon said, I don't want to be on the gold standard anymore. And the Europeans were absolutely livid about it. The Japanese, the Canadians, everybody was holding tons of dollars, which were now going to be worth much, much less. And they were screaming. Nixon sent John R. Connally there. He was the Treasury Secretary at Texan. And he's, what are we supposed to do? And he said, well, our dollar, it's your problem. We're not going to do anything for you. And what I like about the title is, first, it captures the arrogance of the United States, which comes up again and again, which I don't like. I describe at the beginning my living in Europe as a teenager, being a professional chess player, and sort of coming across how people loved Americans, they hated Americans. And I thought, that this arrogance is certainly a piece of it. It's also ironic because the dollar, the inflation was our problem. It was the 1970s were the worst decade we've had, and even worse than the 2010s. So anyway, I've gone on too long, but thank you.
Thanks very much for that. Can I sort of probe a little bit more around this idea of whose problems the US dollar dominance is, and in particular this idea that, given the turmoil that we've seen over the last couple of weeks, perhaps it is nudging down in its dominance. Does that create a problem? Does it create a problem for the US? Does it create a problem for Europe, for Africa, for China? You've said, you were sort of motivating that actually, the G5 central banker was unhappy. But would they be unhappy if the dollar, faced a demise over the next few months? Who does it create problems for?
Well, so a major problem is that when the country in charge of the system, at the top of the systems, doing a chaotic job running its country, its government, it spills over to everyone. So I think we're going to end up in a period and by the way, I think it would have been pretty bad if Harris won. I just want to be clear. That's part of how I had this vision, because I talked to her people and see what they wanted to do. And I thought we faced a situation with a weak situation in many ways, with two very unfortunate choices. I mean, I supported Harris publicly, but I wasn't happy about it. So I think we have a period of a lot of volatility, much more volatility than we've gotten used to. I don't know what that's a very vague word of what it translates into. If you want to hear the word financial crisis, yes, somewhere there will much more likely now that we'll have financial crisis, but a lot of exchange rate volatility. I see reasons we'd have another burst of inflation in the coming years. So just generally bad management leads bad for everybody. But you're very narrowly on the dollar not being as dominant. Oh, it definitely will raise the interest rate that we pay. You saw that in the blink of an eye of what happened when Trump announced the tariffs. And given that I think we are already having problems with debt sustainability in the United States. I mean, we have problems with debt sustainability in the sense we can inflate, we can do a lot of things, but we don't really have a plan for it. And then the national security issue is like a big deal. So Russia and China trade a lot. We try to sanction it. Right now, actually, I think they're doing a lot of their trade in tether and what they're using, but that's not an ideal thing. So having other pipeways to do things is very helpful. Our financial networks is a big part of our spying, and cyber. used to be in the CIA, you see somebody's in the CIA, and they're like have some glamorous James Bond type, well, not as glamorous as James Bond, but glamorous kind of thing. No, you're like in a little room, reading computers and tracing out what people are doing, and a lot of that's in finance. So it's certainly some loss of power, which a lot of the world wants us to lose. But that's, as an American, I would probably rather we didn't.
Andrea.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for organizing this event to Blavatnik School, and thanks a lot to Ken for coming over. I just want to say beforehand that I think I'm hugely indebted to Ken for all his academic work. I think his book with Maurits C really was a big factor why I got into academic economics. And his work on current account sustainability was actually very inspiring for my very first paper. So I owe a big intellectual debt to him. When I received the book, I thought it was kind of going to be a rather technical book about the dollar and exchange rates. And there are obviously aspects, I think you were mentioning before. There are aspects of it, but it's written in a extremely interesting and engaging way, and I really enjoy it. And also the style that you alluded to before, with the personal experiences, an academic economist and as a policy maker as well. So it made for a very interesting read. So overall, I think I learned a lot, and on most of the stuff that I know about, I generally agree with the view and the conclusions. But I guess there are maybe a couple of points where, also in the interest of discussion, I want to go. The first has to do with the benefits of having a reserve currency that you talk about. And in the last 20 years or so, there's been a formalization of some of the ideas that underpin what make a reserve currency. And one of which is this idea that the US are the banker of the world, which in very simple way means issuing safe, although I know you don't like so much the word, but let's say safe, relatively safe or safer liabilities, primarily debt, and investing in risky assets, FDIs and stocks. Sort of as a consequence, given that portfolio composition at the macro level, it turns out that for a number of years, the US have enjoyed what's the literature is called the exorbitant privilege, which is that has made a lot of money on the assets they invested in and paid relatively little on the liability they owe to the rest of the world. And this is, I think, fascinating. I think there's been recent research on the end of the exorbitant privilege. But I think, in general, I think describes the last maybe 20 years or so pretty well. At the heart of this idea, there is something related to the reserve currency, which is what are the characteristics of the reserve currency. And one element that is very important in the discussion, and you allude to in the book, is the idea of liquidity of dollar-denominated assets. There is a huge demand for dollar-denominated assets and so on. There's this paper that I'm sure you know, because I saw that you are thanked by the authors, by Antonio Coppola, Arvind Krishnamurti, and a third author, the name escapes me right now, that talks about liquidity as the defining element of the international financial system and why a reserve currency arises. So I was wondering whether the extent to which you agree with that view, that really liquidity is dominant. Let me just quickly elaborate on that, and then I hope that you can say something about it. So the idea in that paper, if I understand correctly, is that when the private sector wants to issue some assets, they have to think about in which currency they want to issue those assets. And the liquidity of the dominant currency kind of pins down a lot of the decisions of the private sector because makes those assets more widely acceptable. And so I think that is interesting because it sort of diminishes maybe a little bit the view that to have a reserve currency you need that political power, geopolitical power, although you could argue, well, maybe the two are correlated. And the example they give is about the Dutch florin. In the 17th century, the Dutch florin was the reserve currency, but Spain and France, you could argue, were the geopolitical superpower. Admittedly, it's probably the only example that really works and fits well with the theory. But there's one implication of the theory that I also found fascinating that goes back to something that you were saying before, which is that in that theory, there's never going to be an equilibrium with multiple currency survive. There's only going to be one reserve currency, which is a little bit different from this possibility of going to a multiple currency, maybe euro, RMB, dollar equilibrium. And so I was wondering how you think about that.
Okay, well, the third co-author is Chen Zizhu,
Yes.
who's a former student of mine.
Excellent.
It's a great paper. If you just didn't take political economy out of it, you always want one currency. That's the efficient thing. So any model kind of built around no political economy, and it's just a pure, technical economics problem, you will always have one currency. We have not always had one currency. We have many periods where there are multiple currencies. Of course, the most recent in between the wars when really the pound and the dollar were equal. But you can go back in the transition period, say, from the Dutch florin to the pound, which was not that sudden. I mean, they were kind of co-equal for a long time. And I'm being a little glib in that during that period, no one was in China and India, and there were big parts of the world. The Spanish pieces of 8 were actually circulating very heavily for a long time. There's different different reasons you'd want different currencies. So I think I actually have a big objection to a lot of macro as it has evolved in ignoring political economy, pretending that's not an issue with central banking, pretending that's not an issue with international relations. There's another large growing literature, I'm sure you know, called Geoeconomics, which is growing, which exactly is about this. Let me take the example of military. That surprises people when I say military is important. Why on earth would that matter? Why would you care? How could that affect the system? Of course, there's a very crude thing that you're harder to invade and take over, and which seems silly to say 5 years ago, but a little less silly now. But that's not really that's a subtext. But the bigger thing is when you are the dominant military power, it helps you control the rules. It's a subtext. Now, when you hear Donald Trump, he just very bluntly says it. BRICS, you don't use the dollar, I won't trade with you, or Canada, you don't use the dollar, I won't defend you. He actually says that all the time. If you don't do what I want in the economic sphere, I won't defend you. If you look at the Nixon papers and what Reagan did and what we've been doing for a long time, it's just not as heavy-handed, but it's the same thing. And by having that power, you can have SWIFT, basically it's European, but basically regulated by the United States. You can make sure all the rails go through the United States. So you get to make the rules of the game. But it's absolutely the case that in a perfect world we would have one currency.
Do you want to follow up?
No, I mean, I guess the other point has more to do with history, and So I was curious about, like you said, in the 70s when sort of Bretton Woods collapsed, the kind of it wasn't obvious that the dollar would have survived, right? As reserve currency, you could think that something else could have emerged. In some sense, it was Nixon who took. Not in some sense. I mean, it was Nixon who took the dollar.
It was a big drop in the dollar's status. So if you did, how important was it? That was a big step down.
Right.
There was a while where it wasn't obvious. Yeah.
Right. And so do you think it has to do just with the fact that there was no credible alternative in some sense? You talk about how the Soviet Union was a political power, but economically perhaps was not as integrated in the world economy like the US were. I guess Japan was not yet there, where it ended up in the 80s, then experienced the crisis, so wouldn't work either. Germany maybe had a very anti-inflationary central bank, so in terms of institution could have played a bigger role, but was still somewhat reconstructing, and so on. One thing that I read, and I didn't know anything about it, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this, is what role do you think oil played and the fact that world markets for oil are denominated in dollars? There's this agreement between Saudi Arabia and the US. Some people say it was formal, some people say it's informal. So this idea of the petrodollar replacing somewhat gold in underpinning the international value of the dollar.
So first of all, I give a bunch of examples in the book places I think things could have gone differently. I think if Europe hadn't invited Greece into the Eurozone, we could be just living in a different world than we had. I mean, it's still, I apologize to Greeks here. We'd just be living it. Greece wasn't ready. It just didn't meet the criteria. Obviously didn't meet the criteria. Famously, France insisted on it. Portugal was also weak, but not the same degree that Greece was. And if we hadn't had the euro crisis, the euro might have had a bigger footprint than it does. We just don't know. There are other examples I give of this around what happened to the yen, what happened to the Chinese currency. So I think there's a tendency, you see where we are, and that's where we had to be. And I think economists, certainly opinion makers, are always overstating this, that it was inevitable. I think if Xi hadn't come along in China and really held back growth in China, did a lot of bad things that held them back, China would have expanded more and had a system a little different than what we're looking at today.
I think probably it's time to open up to everyone else. So thank you so much to Andrea for probing
thank you.
The themes on the book. So I'm sure there are questions. What we're going to do is we'll take them in groups of 3. Ken's been supplied with a branded notebook to write your questions down. And we'll then come back for several rounds within the room.
It's not an empty branded notebook.
Oh, is it?
So
Oh,
I
gave you the wrong one. Okay, you've got my notes.
Read it from
okay. And then to give the people online chance to put their questions in. So we'll take a couple of rounds in the room and then we'll go to those online. So I think the first was at the back, the gentleman in the sort of rose-coloured shirt at the back. Sorry, I can't see anybody that I know, so I can't use names. Gentleman at the front.
Thank you.
And another at the front here, Jaylee. Okay.
Simple question.
And just introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry, Ralph Schroeder, Oxford Internet Institute. Other things equal, are there any ways that you see of the US reducing its debt, and how does that affect your argument?
Yes. Could you say a bit more about cyber and whether the its growth might enhance the dominance of the dollar through stable coins. The fact that so many now that people are willing to hold are linked to the dollar.
And could you pass to the gentleman just behind you?
I'm John Hoffmeyer from Oxford Center for Mutual and Co-Owned Business. When you measure the value the U.S. derives from having the dollar be the dominant currency, and you compare that measurable value to the assumed disadvantage the U.S. faces in trade, which is bigger, the advantage of the dollar or the assumed disadvantage the U.S. faces in trade?
Thank you for those questions. I'm actually start with the last question because it's so on point about the whole political debate in the United States. So, setting political economy questions aside, the U.S. it's just win-win from what the situation is. The trade deficits that Donald Trump so dislikes, the flip side of that are capital inflows to the United States, which are creating jobs, bidding up the price of housing, allowing us to consume more. There's nothing wrong with running trade imbalances now. If you have problems in your regulatory system, there are problems internally in your country, like emerging markets routinely have, well, that's a different matter. You have to ask what the reason is. And I tell this story briefly in the book, but I worried about that a lot in the early 2000s when the U.S. trade deficit went like that out of the blue. It just shot up. And I wrote papers with Maurits C about this. And we very prominently gave these papers. We did not quite know what was going on. I'll be honest with you. You can read the papers. We were very suspicious of it. It was only later when I was doing my book with Carmen Reinhart that we realized that it was the regulatory failures in the United States that were helping bid up money. I tell a story in the book of I'm worried about it and telling people something's fishy here because you don't see trade balances go up like this. And I got to speak right after Alan Greenspan, who back then was the maestro. There's a book about him called The Maestro, and he was just God. I think that was 2003. And he gets up and gives this speech, which is about the current account. It's fine. It's great. We have the best financial system in the world. Everyone loves us. It diversifies everything. Everything's perfect. And implicit, Alan Greenspan, one of the major regulators, doing a great job. And I came right after him. And it's not easy to speak after someone of that stature for many reasons. One of which is everyone's leaving. And there were, just as the back of this room, camera crews, and they're all closing up their cameras and leaving. And I gave my work with Maurits basically and said, I think there's a problem here. This looks very unusual. We've seen this in the past. So a reporter came up to me afterwards, maybe one of the only couple. There were probably 50 there, and a couple stayed to hear us. And he said, so do you think there'll be a problem in the next few weeks? And I said, well, no. And he walked away. But, that's just to say, it doesn't mean that trade balances aren't a problem. And they did go up quite a bit under Biden, actually. But, it's this very superficial diagnosis that he has, Trump has is stupid. I don't know another, untutored. He's not stupid, but he's definitely untutored. Or badly tutored. Let me do the U.S. debt one next. Well, that's a whole theme, and I think I don't think there's any political appetite for reining the debt in the United States, and I think no matter how good things were, we would still have a problem. It's in our DNA. We're just convinced we can never have a problem, and that's when you're going to have a problem. And the problem is not going to express itself in default, though that would be fantastic, for my book. The problems most likely express itself in inflation, which is a form of default, which we had recently. But I think something like that. There's also something called financial repression. People come up to me all the time and say, what about Japan? They have 250% debt to GDP. That's twice what the United States has. They haven't had a debt crisis. Well, no, and we've never argued a country like that would, but they sure the heck had a growth crisis. They had two lost decades. I'm not saying that's the only reason, but their income per capita in market exchange rates was well above the United States around 1990. Even purchasing power parity, which is maybe a more, I don't know if it's more meaningful, but a more stable comparison. They were up in the 80, 85%, and they were higher than all the European countries. And now they're lower than, France, Germany, the UK. They have dropped mightily. So, it's not an example, but you can use financial repression. And I think if it happens under Donald Trump, that's a good bet because he likes, to force things and to make people do stuff. So those are the two most likely outcomes, or some combination of that. We could default on top of that. But inflation's not a final solution, by the way, because inflation scares the bondholders, and then they ask for a higher interest rate. You get on this, get into this, cycle that you can't get out of, and eventually, you need to make some kind of adjustment. On stablecoins, that's a kind of I think stablecoins are the most interesting part of the various Bitcoin and stuff. So the cryptocurrencies compete with the U.S. dollar now in the 20% of the economy, global economy that's underground. And I have papers both on measuring the underground economy, fairly recent papers on this, and papers on demonstrating that crypto is being used very extensively in this, in such transactions. So crypto in general plays a role, but stablecoins could, they could be the future of money. There are different directions things can go, and yeah, it definitely could help the dollar to have them be in dollars, but countries can regulate them, so we'll see what they do.
Okay, great. Let's take Andrea. Actually, before I do, would you like to?
No, why don't we take another round?
Another round.
Come back.
The gentleman at the back. Another one in the middle at the back. We have some gender representation. Anyone other than a gentleman want to ask a question? Another question? Okay, we'll take those two and then we'll come back for more.
Thank you. The IMF...
Can you just introduce yourself?
My name is Samuel Banda. I'm an MPP student here at the School of Blavatnik. I'm also a central banker from Malawi. The IMF continuously use net international reserves as a tool to implement an IMF framework in most developing nations. And the dollar has been used as the reserve currency, and for nations that are in a phase where our export capacity is extremely limited to generate the dollars, what solutions could you advise nations such as Malawi in regards to how we can diversify that, or how we can negotiate with the IMF on different terms?
Thanks for the talk. I'm Fan Qi. I'm from Oxford Sociology Department and also the Oxford China Center. So my question is on gold. So what do you think of gold? And I think as reported, the US states has the largest gold reserve in the world. And do you think it will impact the market, especially in the currency market and so on? Thanks.
Do you want to take those two, and then we'll come back for more?
Sure. The IMF question is a very tough question. I mean, this is multi-dimensional. I don't have a glib answer to you to do that. I will say historically, the IMF has not had much of a role in Africa. It's been just giving advice and not making loans so much. And the World Bank has been really taking the lead, doing this. It's more lending that's at very favorable terms, and usually has a large aid element. The IMF's not well designed to do loans in Africa, but as circumstances, the pandemic and the IMF's moved very heavily into these things. I think the governing body wanted it to. And it's going to have a hard time digging its way out because a lot of these loans should have been grants, and they just shouldn't have been loans in the first place. I've written about that a lot. That's still a way out of consensus view, but I think it's just a mistake to be doing these things in terms of loans. But anyway, I don't have an easy answer. Gold's interesting in that, I think people often say Bitcoin is the new gold. I actually think gold is the new gold. I think people underestimate the value of gold and diversification. The Russians and the Chinese don't. I mean, they've been piling up gold into their reserves because they're worried about the sanctions the U.S. will put on. I will say, there are people who think we should go back to the gold standard, it's idiotic. Like, if we did that, that would be worse than the tariff war, but you can find people who think that.
Question here? And then one in the center.
Thank you. I'm Marlon, and I use US dollars in Zimbabwe. So I have a question as a future policymaker. In one of your speeches that I've seen online, you mentioned that if it were up to you, you would call for a freeze on AI to avoid some of the mistakes that were made with the lack of regulation with social media and now the problems that we're seeing. So I wonder, your approach to cryptocurrency, would you also call for kind of like a freeze or more regulation of cryptocurrency? And do we actually have the capability to regulate cryptocurrency? Thank you.
Hi, Zach Maslish. I'm a PhD student in econ here. My understanding is for the last 15 years or so, there's been a view that the Chinese have undervalued their currency, and this has in part led to their big export surpluses. But if you look at the market action the last couple of years, it seems more like the renminbi's been supported by the Chinese, where it should actually be even cheaper than it is. And I'm just wondering if you have any view on how to reconcile those two narratives, why it seems like the market wants to cheapen the renminbi, even though the dollars may be falling in status, whatever. Yeah.
Let me start with crypto. I'm going to leave out the AI question, which is a really interesting one, but it's like too far afield. I'm very much in favor of heavily regulating crypto, and my neighbor is Elizabeth Warren, if you know who that is, in Cambridge, and I like to joke, that I strongly agree with her on 3 out of every 10 issues, and this is absolutely one of them. She wants to do that, and I cover this a lot in the book, and it's very hard. It's very hard to literally regulate on-chain transactions, which is most of what you read about with Bitcoin. But at least, again, referring to my work and others, probably 95% of all transactions are off-chain, maybe even 98%. What do I mean by that? They're basically banks. Coinbase is like an important example, where you can hold your crypto. It's just a bank. There's nothing private about it if the government regulated it. And the existence of these has blown up the price because it creates the network effects, it creates liquidity. And I think if I you know, I often in a young audience ask how many people have crypto, and a huge percentage of them raise their hands, but you find out peeling into it that an awful lot of them are doing it through a bank. So that they're crypto banks are subject, totally you can regulate them, they're subject to the same problems. I think it's a terrible thing that Trump has come in and said, forget that, we're not going to do that. It's going to blow up. I mean, one financial crisis we can just know is going to happen is in crypto. And it's going to, this time, unlike FTX, which happened in 2023, which I write about in the book, this one is going to infect the whole system. I don't know how bad it'll be, but he's telling pension funds, insurance companies, banks, they're all able to do this. I think it's a big mistake. On the Chinese currency, I have 6 chapters on this, so I invite you, invite you to look at that. But of course, it's gone through cycles.
Other questions? We can come back to you, sir. Julie, I can't actually see any online. Do you know if any have come in? Could you double check whilst we pass the mic back? Could you come and pass the mic back over here?
Yeah, maybe just following up on China, but from a slightly different angle. There's one thing you say in the book which I thought was extremely interesting, which is which you call the Tokyo Consensus, which is some sort of hybrid system, right? Where there is more focus compared to previous systems of Asian countries pegging their exchange rate straight out. More focus on domestic inflation, stabilization. Still some sort of intervention in FX markets, accumulation of reserves that also help on the side of ensuring maybe the financial system, and some sort of measure of capital controls, maybe not everywhere, but in some countries. I mean, what really struck me as interesting is that in this combination, capital controls do not sound as bad as sometimes used to have a bad rep in the past. And also the IMF seems to have switched a little bit that view along those lines. Would you agree with that?
So let me take something concrete. So first of all, there's this marvelous series of papers written by David Folkerts-Landau, Peter Garber, and Mike Dooley that put forward this idea of the Bretton Woods II, saying essentially that the Asian countries were doing just what the European countries were doing. And if you looked at the European countries in the 50s, they were just imitating that, and they were growing in the same way. And it was very provocative. Ben Bernanke's Global Savings Glut speech is basically, I won't use the word rip-off, but exposition of those. He was a discussant of their papers at Brookings before, I was at that panel before the Global Savings Glut. That's their idea. I cite them heavily in the book, but I argue, the right way to look at it is everybody was imitating Japan. Like Japan worked, and then Korea did what Japan did, and it worked. And there are many elements to it. Let me sort of narrow in on the technical question you're asking. Part of this does involve having capital controls because it's easier to regulate your exchange rate. They don't necessarily fix it in these cases, but they regulate their exchange rate when you have capital controls. And I explain why in the book, that it basically prevents arbitrageurs from undoing what you would do when you have regulation. And coming to the current world, you may have read about the Mar-a-Lago consensus. If in your finance, you've certainly read about that, which is what's going to happen next after the tariffs, where the U.S. is going to sort of beat up on everybody to appreciate their exchange rates, and there's other elements to it. And it's paralleled after what we did to Japan. The Plaza Accord in 1985, and where Japan was, pardon my French, but kicking our ass in everything, and the United States didn't like it. Its per capita GDP had gotten higher. You may not be able to imagine this, but the Japanese stock market was worth more than the U.S. stock market. Japan, which is an island with land about the size of California, its real estate was worth more than everything in the United States. And there were many, many measures of this. And we tried some things to deal with it, but then finally we forced them to basically double their exchange rate. The story is told in the book. And at first it seemed to have backfired, but ultimately I think led, and one can debate this, but I think ultimately led to their collapse for 2 decades. I actually use it in the book as an example of something where I changed my mind, because there's a gap between when the Plaza Accord was 1985, and it's hard to know quite when to date the Japanese financial crisis, but it's 6 or 7 years later for sure they had entered their financial crisis. So how can it be that it caused it? And that's what I said for a long time. But then I know the Japanese didn't feel that way, the Chinese didn't feel that way. In fact, the governor of the Central Bank of Japan famously, did this deep bow and apology 10 years after for I have destroyed our country, with what I did. And I sort of, that's an example of something I give where I think I was wrong and came around to the view that, we really damaged them. Essentially, they weren't ready for prime time with their regulation and their monetary policy. They just weren't ready. They didn't have frameworks in either place to deal with the onslaught of capital and inflows that came in. So anyway, there's a lot to unpack there.
There is also in the book an interesting parallel with some similarities and a lot of differences with China. In terms of the pressure to appreciate their currency coming out of the early 2000s, abandon the peg, and the switch from export-led growth to domestic consumption-led growth, but then the differences kick in, right? Because China is a very different type of political framework.
You mean the parallels to Japan?
With Japan, yeah, in terms of the exchange rate and.
So, but there are very strong parallels despite Japan's being infinitely richer than China. When Japan had its crisis, it was a rich country, and then it slowly decayed. China is very worried about getting stuck at a low level, but the parallels in the overbuilding of infrastructure, Japan had this sort of famous expression, bridges to nowhere. Hospitals, there was no patients for, and huge overbuilding of housing actually in Japan. And China has just done the same thing. I don't know if you've been to China, you should, but what's sort of shocking is that it's not just if you go to Beijing and Shanghai, and I talk in the book, I first went in 2002 and then went even, I guess, 10 years, 12 years later, you just, it's like a different planet that you're on. But you can go around the whole country and it looks like that. That's just been a disaster. They concentrated everything and they never made it to consumption-led growth. Yeah. They just haven't figured it out. Even right now, President Xi is balking at doing what we would think of as classic Keynesian stimulus. I mean, investment is Keynesian stimulus, but he doesn't like handouts. So they had consumption, I don't know how you measure it, but 45% of GDP in China versus 70% in the United States. From the UK, 62%. I don't know what it is exactly here. Greece is another 70% country, but most countries are like, 60, 65%, and China's 45%. And you're in a recession, don't you want to get them to consume? And it's not just cultural, there's no social security, there's no medical care, there's no education, if you go in different places, so people are desperate to save money. and they don't seem to have figured out how to dig their way out of that.
Can I actually ask someone, so we've got some new hands up, would that be okay, given you've already asked the question? Could you pass to one of the chaps just behind you?
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm Andrea Ferrero's graduate student, actually. Looking at competitors to the US dollar, is a fiscal union in the Eurozone needed for the euro to be an alternative competitor to the dollar?
Take these two and then.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Tobias Kavalets, also a PhD student here in economics at the University of Oxford. I have a question more about the long-term prospects of the dollar in the world that may stop being in a state of a savings glut. So a lot of the past decades have been shaped through this kind of savings glut, which coincided with the expansion of the stock of treasuries. So some part of the dollar demand may have been attributed to an increase in the demand for treasuries as also a savings asset. Now, some signs might slowly pop up that there is a peak demand basically for those savings assets, be it, for instance, through secular demographic trends in terms of how many assets are needed actually for retirement funds, etc. Given that you mentioned that deficits are unlikely to close in the political environment, and therefore the overall government debt is unlikely to decrease, what can we expect to happen with the dollar in a world where this continuous supply of treasuries is maybe not met with a continuously high demand?
Great questions. I certainly, when I was going around Europe after the financial crisis, I kept talking about the fiscal union, and you have to have a fiscal union or the euro is going to blow up. And I know in France somebody said you must be drinking beer and wine at the same time. That was like their response to that. And they just says never, will we do that? And it was the same everywhere. Donald Trump may have, catalyzed something there, because I think to pay for the military spending at the scale that Europe's going to end up doing, which is much more like 5% of GDP, and they haven't even struggled to 2% of GDP. It's going to be very hard for a lot of the countries to do that without some kind of euro bonds or fiscal, and that'll certainly make a difference. I don't know that the euro can surpass the dollar, but it could have a higher footprint than it does. It's just strictly a regional currency at the moment, which surprised everybody. I mean, it wasn't obvious. On the savings glut, complicated question to unpack. Part of the savings glut was there's so many countries. The United States has been a very dynamic economy where there are investment opportunities and growth opportunities. And I talked about diminishing returns in Japan. Maybe I didn't use the phrase, but the overbuilding in Japan and China led to diminishing returns, and there are just not as many good investments. It's actually somewhat true in a lot of continental Europe. These very big statist economies, and they're just not as dynamic. And you could better high-speed rail. By the way, I was supposed to come to Oxford today on high-speed rail, and
it's not high-speed ever. It was just no speed.
Well, they call it high-speed rail. The official time is faster than when I was the Sanjay Lal visiting professor in 2017. Feels like it's a little faster, but yeah, they're very good at that, but lack the creativity and sort of have run into a bit of a wall in some of that. So some of the savings come from that's where the investments are. But I agree with you. At least it's I really don't like the phrase safe assets, by the way, because trust me, they're not safe. Like, if you haven't figured that out from the 2022, we don't care if you lose your money if we inflate. We just don't care. And the possibility of a more direct intervention, like a tax on foreign holders, or the Mar-a-Lago plan, actually calls for forcing all official foreign holders to take their treasuries, their treasured treasuries, and turning them into 100-year bonds. We will choose the interest rate for you. And by the way, you can't trade them with anyone, but don't worry, we're going to pay the interest. Trust us, we're going to pay the interest. And I think in general, you know, the safety never was as complete. And finally, there's this view that there's just an infinite appetite. But we produce them at such a fast rate that I think people started to recognize in research that it does push the interest rate up slowly. So sort of a back of the envelope number, I've seen from a variety of sources, but I'll name Rachel and Summers' Brookings paper in 2019, and Ludwig Straub, who's one of the young stars in macro at Harvard, has a similar, reaches the number a completely different way, but similarly, for every 10% of GDP, our debt goes up, the real interest rate goes up 0.25%. That doesn't seem like very much, but I mean, our debt in COVID went up 20% of GDP. That's 0.5%. And we're going up really fast if you look at the forecasts. And when you owe $36 trillion, you know, half a percent is real money. And there are a bunch of nice theory papers that go into this.
Thank you so much. We are now at time, so what I'm going to do is draw it to a close. We are going to have a drinks reception outside, and I believe Ken is staying until 7, so you may have an opportunity to ask further questions then. But I just want to give the final word to you. The subtitle of your book is An Insider's View of 7 Turbulent Decades of Global Finance and the Road Ahead. Policymakers globally are grappling with the uncertainty, and you use the term volatility. What do you think is the single most important lesson from those 7 decades that people should keep at the forefront over the next few months coming?
Well, I mean, I'd say the single most important thing is that there are precedents for all these things, and we can look at them. There's a lot of Nixon and Trump. And I will just mention, I lived in the UK as a teenager. I lived between the UK, Spain, and Yugoslavia. I was a professional chess player. And I was turning 18, you know, as Nixon, or I guess 17, when Nixon won the election in 1968. And I had decided, I'm not coming back. And I mean, he was such a loathsome character to me. He seems like, you know, Lincoln now, just a ton. But I'm very sympathetic to all the young people who don't want to come back. But it's very important to have a long arc of history in trying to view things. And I think policymakers, economists get things wrong when they don't at least look at history. It doesn't mean things do change. Sometimes there's a change, but a heck of a lot of times there's just a reversion to mean. There are things we've seen before.
A useful note to end on. Mean reversion, I like it. Thank you very much to everybody who's come today for your questions, for your participation. Thank you very much to Andrea for his thoughtful reading of the book and his questions.
Thank you.
Let's please now move to drinks.